Guys, let's begin. So, thank you. I've been looking forward to this presentation today. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker to you. Dr. Udi Lakaj is one of the real doctors. That's a doctor who actually studies medicine, not people like me who have a doctor of philosophy. Yes. So, Udi is a local person, lives in Kurrambong. He has 3 kids in the back of the room. So if you turn around and wave to the kids, you're very welcome here. I'm sure that you won't be throwing balls down the stairs like we've had in the class, but I enjoyed that. That was good. That was a positive thing. That was nice and exciting. Skittles. You can throw Skittles at me and break anything.
Quietly. The Skittles are okay, but just as long
Skittles are fine. Okay. What can I say about Udi? So, Udi, where are you from originally?
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka?
I'm going to go through a little bit of the path from Sri Lanka to Mandalay.
I'm not going to steal any thunder. So be quiet, sit down and let this man speak. So, Udi, thank you very much, and we will ask some questions at the end if that's all right.
Fantastic, yep. And there's the watch I go by is...
yeah, I'll sing out to you about 10 minutes before.
Okay, no worries. Well, thanks for having me, Brad, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've known Brad for a while now, but when he's mentioned the course, particularly the education-based course, it's usually something that causes a bit of anxiety in, from medical background, talking to people with a career in education. But education in particular was something that I was really keen to share my 2 cents worth on. And this lecture particularly is focused on the content and there is some content, and I have a handout that deals with some of the specific sort of information that is relevant to health and education and how health impacts on education. And if this is a field that you'll be working in, particularly Indigenous education, then there's some literature there. But I'd also like to share, in terms of success, at least as I've seen in Indigenous disadvantaged working with communities, I'd like to share my 2 cents worth as an outsider, as a non-Indigenous person, and so as part of that, just talk about a bit about my work and how it's led me to here. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting, elders past, current and future, and also acknowledge my 3 kids who I had to pull out of school to come because they're missing out on some fun afternoon activities. Stop me at any time if you need. So the content, what I thought I'd do is, the 20 years I've worked since I graduated, pretty much, I'm a public health doctor. I work in clinical work, but also public health work, and pretty much the one rule that often comes back is the health of a child ultimately leads to the health of the adult, and one of the most important determinants of the health of a child is the education status of the mother and the level of empowerment of the mother. So where you see outliers, countries like parts of China or Sri Lanka, Cuba, it's the empowerment of women that starts with completing education. So in terms of health, in many ways you have one of the most important jobs. I'd like to use this time, apart from sharing the content, to get you to share my excitement as a non-Indigenous person about, if I was your age, graduating soon, I can't think of many careers, having worked in New York and Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, Northern Territory, I can't think of many more fulfilling careers in terms of purpose, in terms of utility of my work than work in Indigenous health and Indigenous education, particularly in terms of addressing disadvantage. So I'd like to share some of that with you as well as the content. If we don't get through the content, there'll be time to, as I said, I've got a handout that covers some of it. So just to go through the learning objectives, in the 40 minutes I'd like to cover some of these things, may not cover all of them. Describe the health and burden of disease of Indigenous Australians, has mainly been remote, so that's where I'll be speaking from. But a third of Indigenous Australians live in urban settings, and there are very specific issues related to being rural and remote. I'd like to discuss the health impacts of how health impacts on education, and also vice versa. It's ultimately a cycle that, of cause and effect, is hard to determine. Poor health leads to impacts on education, and education impacts on poor health. Describe and discuss from my experience what I've seen, particularly in rural, remote communities, the role of teachers, and finally to talk about some of the things that I've seen in terms of success. Some of the most amazing young people I've met are teachers working in remote Australia who are doing amazing things. As a GP who's worked in remote communities, I've also seen a lot of teachers who come with anxiety and stress issues, and one of the caveats of really rewarding work in this type of setting is coming with clear eyes about some of the challenges, some of the rewards, and how do I think set yourself up to succeed, because I think that's very important, and self-care and understanding the resources you have is a very important part of that. Is there a question at the background? Sure. So these are some of the references that if you wish to check. Health InfoNet is a very good resource. It's a sort of a repository of all the health information related to Indigenous health that you might want to access. So if you're doing some work, that's a good clearinghouse to go to. And Aboriginal Health Survey has a lot of the statistics that I'll be talking about. Just briefly, when I was born in Sri Lanka, I went to Darwin as a 1-year-old when Dad migrated as an engineer. After Cyclone Tracy, we went to Adelaide, and then I studied at Sydney Uni, did medicine there. And midway through, I was involved with a project called Camp Sadako, where a few Australians were selected to go to a place called Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, where a lot of families from Sudan and different parts of that world had sort of been had fled. The camp was actually running for 2 decades, and so there were many children who were born in the camp and who had grown up in the camp. That was kind of a formative thing for me in terms of using my sort of knowledge that that I gained in terms of after I graduated. And so the year after graduating from Sydney, I went to Afghanistan with MSF, with Doctors Without Borders, which is a humanitarian organisation that has offices in many places, including Australia. A lot of the work in Afghanistan, that was Taliban times, so the literacy of women was very much an issue, and that impacted on all the health outcomes. So I left Afghanistan feeling like what we were doing medically was really a band-aid on some very complex problems. Since then, I worked in countries, many countries, particularly in Africa and India, particularly around nutrition. I'll talk a bit about that later, but nutrition, I think, is one of the early nutrition from -9 months, from conception to the first 3 years. So before school, that period of nutrition is critical for lifelong development. So that's an area I worked in many countries, and after I finished that up, sort of, in terms of development work, you feel there's this tension between working on frontline clinical issues or working directly with populations, and then realising a lot of the challenges that you're dealing with are far removed from that. And so I worked in an advocacy role for a while based in New York with UNICEF as well, and did a lot of work with UN agencies and trying to influence international policy, some of the issues we were working with. And when I came back from New York, I returned to Australia, but was asked to be part of a project in a place called Arnhem. And the work, what I speak about, including the theories, are based on that experience working from 2010 to 2014, and I have some ongoing involvement with Indigenous health at the moment, where as part of my work I'm evaluating a flying doctors program that's trying to address lifestyle issues in some communities in South Australia. So in 2010 we moved to a place called Multicultural Lecture. That's about 600 kilometres east of Darwin, and we're based in the Miwok Health Aboriginal Corporation office in Multicultural Lecture. Many of the remote communities that we worked in were serviced from Multicultural Lecture. That was the base, and then we did remote travel to communities. In every community that I worked, essentially the centre of the community was the school and the health centre. So just to go through some statistics now. I'll go through this relatively quickly, but talk about health in the context of how it may impact on education. We know about the gap. There's national state policies to try and address the life expectancy gap. One of the things that I'll talk about that this has implications on is the median age is much lower, which means that people are attending funerals, and death is a much more common part of young Indigenous person's life than it is a non-Indigenous person. The other thing that just demographically that's important is the age distribution is much different in non-Indigenous to an Indigenous population in Australia. So there's much more representation of young people, whereas in mainstream Australia, the non-Indigenous population, there's that the ageing of the population, so the demographic shift has occurred. Although we are seeing in Indigenous health many of the diseases of chronic diseases that are associated with the demographic transition. But this has implications for health and for education. So just going to some of the main domains where poor health can impact on education, and it's something that I mean, I'll talk about some personal stories, but it's hard to often in the clinic or in the classroom you might see things playing out, children who are not listening or having behavioural issues, or in the case of health with absenteeism, parents who don't seem to be engaged. And virtually every time when you get the chance to look into the whole story of what may be going on in a child's life, it's imminently understandable in the sense of the pressures and issues that might be impacting on the child. And for pretty much in every case, for me, it was obvious that it wasn't the individual factors, but it was the system structural issues that were playing out. And the trick was to find ways that as an individual you can intervene within a structural thing where there may be issues like food security or things like that, to still have an impact on quality of life and well-being. In terms of prenatal health, it's very important. So again, it's the nutrition and well-being of the mother, but things like maternal smoking and alcohol consumption can impact on health of the child and then education in many ways. Intellectual disabilities are a common issue that affects education, and things like fetal alcohol syndrome and prenatal factors like poor nutrition, etc., can impact on health. So a lot of our work in terms of health education was focused on health education and health literacy for young men and women in schools. That's where we did a lot of the education. Healthy mums and healthy partners produce healthy kids. So the things around reaching people before they had their children, particularly things like nutrition and antenatal visits. When there's not that literacy and not that engagement, often we find women coming essentially for the first time to the clinic when they're ready to deliver. So it means all the prenatal nutrition, prenatal vaccinations, things that can lead to significant disabilities and birth defects and things like that can get missed without that antenatal care. The value of that antenatal care comes from partly engaging young people early on in terms of the importance of it. There's a lot of work being done around smoking and things like alcohol. A lot of communities I worked were dry, so that was less of an issue. Low birth weight is another factor that has implications for child development, and there's a high prevalence of low birth weight. Low birth weight is linked to things like smoking, but also maternal nutrition. And it's intergenerational, so a mother who has been malnourished as a child will give birth to a child that also has issues to do with stunted growth and things like that. It can be intergenerational. The window to intervene is from conception till the first 3 years. After that, catch-up sort of nutrition strategies can actually lead to chronic problems like obesity and the metabolic syndrome issues like diabetes. So the window to intervene safely is the early period. And again, so one of the more valuable programs that I've seen running was a thing that was run by the schools, but it was called Families as First Teachers, and a program targeting young parents before school. There's also still a very, even though there's that transition from infections to chronic diseases, infections are still a very high burden. The work I was doing was, as a public health doctor, was around an infection called scabies and its complications. But just to go through some of the infections that will impact on health, respiratory infections are very common during the wet season. We'd see a lot of respiratory illness. There's vaccinations now that have been introduced, like pneumococcal, that prevents kids going rapidly to pneumonia and then hospitalisation, but that is an issue. And recurrent chest infections, for example, much higher rates. Some of the stats I'm quoting are from the Northern Territory Emergency Response health checks that were done. There's real gaps in the data we have on Indigenous populations. That's something that colleagues that I work with at the National Centre for Epidemiology are looking to address. A lot of the data we have currently are based on small surveys, some in WA, some in the ENT, but not really systematic data collection, partly to do with identification. That's currently a voluntary thing for health providers. The question of whether someone's Indigenous or not is not routinely asked, and so the data there are significant issues in the data we have. So just going quickly, respiratory infections, chest infections and GI infections, those are the two most common causes of death in children internationally. We've been able to, with the rotavirus vaccine in Australia and the pneumococcal vaccine and the Hib vaccine, we've been able to prevent deaths. That's now significantly decreased, those two issues. But the infections are there, and that can cause problems with children during the early period of life, having repeated infections that can lead to chronic problems that I'll talk about in a little while. It's also much higher rate of eye infections. Trachoma is something that's still an issue. Trachoma is caused by an infection called chlamydia. There are programs to do mass dosing to try and control it, but trachoma infection in childhood can cause scarring of the cornea and blindness. It's the most common cause of blindness internationally. In Australia, we have reduced the rates, but it's still an issue, and you see outbreaks in remote communities. So a child with a red eye, a child with a watery eye is something to notify the child health nurse at the clinic, or many schools that I have worked with have nurses in the clinic. And then eye problems can lead to vision issues. Refractory issues, problems with reading most commonly are still due to correction issues, and one of the challenges in remote communities and in Indigenous populations is they have lower rates of things like optometry checks. So again, a teacher is in a key position to refer to the clinic to get some of those checks done. And then skin infections, as I said, that's the area I worked on. The reason was scabies is an infestation of the skin, causes intense itch. It's many communities, particularly in the north, for example, streptococcal infections that damage your kidney and heart. And so many kids have a disease called rheumatic heart disease that requires heart valve surgery, and the kidney disease can lead to renal problems, so chronic renal kidney problems that are also very common in Indigenous populations. So this is just an example of scabies mite, and that's something that you'll see a lot of if you work in remote communities. This is not contagious, but the mite is. The sores that develop can contain a bug called strep A that can damage your heart and kidney. So again, it's another thing to notify the staff if you see it. And there's a severe form of the disease that I've worked with that can cause outbreaks, and again, it's, if you see many children in a classroom scratching, it's something to trigger whether or not there's a child with this, living in a family with this condition.
Can you go back to that? I don't understand the picture on the bottom right-hand side.
So that's skin sores. Scabies calls it intense itch. So as I said, 7 out of 10 kids, the surveys that we were doing can have this. There's mass treatment campaigns, and the one that I was running was across East Arnhem, so about 10,000 people we were trying to get rates down, because it's something that can be transmitted child to child. But because of the intense itch, the studies on quality of life show they often are up all night scratching, so they'll be tired at school. There's stigma and bullying of children with bad skin, so healthy skin is something that people value a lot. So that can lead to absenteeism and things like that. But from the itch, the skin will go from these sort of pustules to then breaking down and developing sores. And the sores get an infection called streptococcal A that causes an autoimmune damage to the heart and kidneys. So it could cause chronic problems. So from the mite, this is a symptom that the scabies mite is active. It causes an immune rash, but because of the itch, children will be scratching quite a lot and develop skin sores. Then this is probably one of the things you may have heard about ear infections and hearing loss. That's the work around dealing with this is very much centred around the classroom. Very high rates. It's caused by recurrent ear infections, and often due to blocked eustachian tube, the tube that connects the ear to the sinuses. The preventative strategy, the way to prevent ear infections is to good hygiene, washing of the face, and blowing your nose, and that's something that the health promotion campaigns try and encourage. But with recurrent ear infections, you get blue ear, chronic sort of build-up of fluid in the ear that can then cause scarring of the drum, perforation of the eardrum, which they're very high rates. And so again, prevention is the main strategy, but detecting secondary prevention, so picking up the disease early to then refer to ENT and other services that might be visiting is an important role, and it starts with identifying the children who may have the issue. Often the first presentation is not necessarily, you won't necessarily see that the child's not hearing well, but it might be it's detected from poor behaviour and things. Children who are not hearing well often get frustrated, and so behavioural issues are more common in children with hearing problems that improve when you address the hearing issues. I'll go through this relatively quickly because there's endless details, but just to give you an overall picture without sort of creating the impression that things are hopeless, because that's definitely not the case. Child mortality has decreased significantly in Indigenous under 5 population. There's a lot of positive areas and a lot that schools are doing in this area. How are we going for time? 20?
Well, it's 20:30, so 20 minutes.
20 minutes? That means 20 minutes to questions, or?
20 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of questions.
Okay. So the other area is malnutrition. This is one of the things I worked for 10 years on malnutrition internationally, particularly in areas with very high rates like Niger and parts of India. In Australia, we don't have food security, but we do have situations where the child, and particularly the mother or the primary carer within a household, may not be able to access the resources to protect health and well-being of a child. So you might have food security within a household, but whether or not the child has food security or can access the foods it needs is a different issue. But this is probably one of the most important interventions in terms of child well-being. A child who's well nourished at 3 has the building blocks for health and education. Without that, that's a period of rapid growth. So you'll see the child in there, particularly from 6 months, so up until 6 months, children are exclusively breastfed. And in Australia, we have very high rates of breastfeeding, higher actually in Indigenous populations than in the mainstream. So the breastfeeding campaigns have worked. So you see children doing really well up until 6 months. And 6 months is then the age of complementary feeding. So you need to add sort of solids to the child's diet. And it's an age also where children are crawling, so they can putting things in their mouth. So internationally, particularly in disadvantaged communities, that's where you see children dropping off in terms of their weight and their height. But it's also a period of rapid growth. You can actually measure overnight the changing sort of length of the femur, for example, with very finely calibrated measures. It's a period of rapid growth, which means it needs very nutrient-rich complementary foods. And without those, if for example, children fill their tummies up with Coke or with bread, with low nutrient, energy-dense food, you'll see a drop-off. And that period is not only when the body's growing skeletally, but it's when the immune system's developing, when the brain's developing. And a child who reaches 3 years of age poorly nourished has not only long-term health problems, but there's studies that show they have lower achievement at schools, lower income earning potential over the course of their life. So it's a key period to intervene. And the most important thing you can do is talk about nutrition to young mothers and their partners. So the teens in schools are a key demographic that a lot of health promotion campaigns try and target. And I'll talk about some of the things that I've seen done around this area. So now poor nutrition is a key issue, and now we're seeing a lot of obesity as well. That's the same, actually, it's the same side of it's a flip side of the same coin. It's again poor nutrient foods but high in calories. So you can have poor nutrient foods, low in calories, but you can equally get poor nutrient foods with high calories. So you may not be growing and developing well, even though obesity may be an issue. Anemia is another problem to do with iron-rich foods and with parasites that cause the loss of iron. And there's particularly hookworm internationally is a big issue and has been an issue in remote communities. And anemia can cause not only developmental delays but also cognitive issues that make learning and things like that hard. Another thing you'll see in schools is poor dental hygiene. I saw an amazing group of young teachers in a community called Upware doing practical things around dental hygiene. So there's 2 issues that often occur. The caries that are from acid-producing bacteria from sugary foods, and the second is poor hygiene. And this group of teachers, 20-something teachers identified that there were programs that provided toothbrushes, but often there was just nowhere for the family for an individual to leave their toothbrush, and which meant it got shared and then often discarded because people didn't know whose it was. So they worked with the men's shed to develop a little rack something small, practical, that actually had an impact on rates of brushing teeth. And injuries are very common actually, so falls, but also things like MVAs, and that leads to absenteeism. And finally, mental health. So I just want to go to this graph in terms of the amount of stresses that a family and then young people will face in a lifetime. Because of the lower life expectancy, many people, during the 4 or 5 years that I've been working, you end up going to a lot of funerals, and so it's something that children often have the death of a very close relative. They have to deal with that. It's much higher rates than the mainstream child would have to deal with. And that means not only the issues related to grief and loss, but also with absenteeism. Funerals are a long, protracted ceremony often, and so people will be absent for a while. That takes precedence over everything because of the connection to land and family and kin, and the stories and the songs that are told at the times of funerals. And so people will stop everything, including work and school, to go. And part of managing someone's health or education for, at least in my experience, is that you have to factor in when you're doing health promotion campaign or looking at the year's syllabus, that there will be times when a child is absent for a significant period of time. So stress, the amount of stress that's facing people is much higher, and the number one cause is the death of a family member, but also keeping up with schoolwork. Once you fall behind, the stress, that's something that's been commonly reported, falling behind and not being able to keep up. And that leads to children avoiding school, but also bullying. And in the work that I've seen is children with health issues or skin issues that have been bullied. So mental health is another issue. I think you may have been, the previous speakers may have talked about what's behind this, but the determinants of poor health, which are this framework that talks about the individual factors, then social, community, family factors, and then the environment are very important. And in Indigenous communities particularly, people losing the connection to the ancestral land, something that I've seen many a time when we've been invited to ceremony. The strength of connection is incredible. People will come back from overseas, from communities far and far away when there's a funeral or when there's a ceremony. We've been part of men's business ceremonies, and once that connection is broken, it's hard to imagine, but at least seeing how people will, what a priority that is in terms of their life. When that's broken, then I think there's a big consequence of that. There's also things like the stolen generation, and then there's very immediate things like substance abuse and gambling, for example, in the communities that I work with, that can impact on well-being of the family and then the child. So, having said that, what are some things that can happen? I want to talk about these main areas. So early detection and referral, that's something very, that's where teachers and schools are very important. There's a thing that we do with the clinics, health centres do with schools, which is the annual school checks. Sometimes they run in the school, sometimes they run in the clinic, but again, they can't be done without the support of teachers and schools. We have community-wide health promotion campaigns, and that's something that the schools have been very integral to, that I'll talk about. Again, my experience is in the top end of Australia. Then there's school-based health education. I've spoken about some of them to do with teenagers and youth, but also the young children and young mothers and preschoolers. So that's something that also has been facilitated by schools, and where we're invited to come and speak and talk about some of their health issues. probably the one area I'd like to, if I had to pick a silver bullet that I think schools can do, it's around school retention, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And finally, it's something I've seen that I'd just like to share, that this can be some of the most rewarding work. You know, I've worked in suburban Sydney and in New York and now in the Central Coast, but the work I did in Central Australia, in the top end, probably is some of the most satisfying, fulfilling work. And I'd like to talk a bit about what may get in the way of that and cause burnout and things, because ultimately to be a good teacher, I think, or a good health practitioner in a remote community or working with another culture or population is that you are well and healthy yourself. So early detection, these are some of the things that I think health centres won't detect without the help of schools. Many schools, the larger schools I work with, have actually child health nurses that might facilitate this, but ultimately poor hearing and speech delays in developmental milestones, teachers are critical in terms of identifying and flagging to health centres that there may be an issue. Secondly, things like vision and reading and other developmental delays with milestones, whether it's social or not, can herald a health issue that needs further assessment, and often a health centre may involve a paediatrician in following that up. And then early detection of mental health and substance misuse. When I was working with the Akala school, there the teachers were involved with elders and others in a petrol sniffing campaign. It's very interesting. There's that community had been dry, there hadn't been an issue, and then one young teenager who the kids looked up to had some issues with their family. There was a lot going on with his family. He went off the rails, and that one child was able to influence all his peers, and it was like a contagion effect. And so part of the work that the school did and the clinic did to try and address this with the elders were to see how that child could be taken to country. That's something that often families do when there's problems. They'll go back to their homeland, which is the very small bit of land that they have the long ancestral connection. Communities that I'm talking about are ones that were artificially created by governments or missions and things like that, where they've brought together different clans, and sometimes that has had issues. So that connection with their original homeland, as they say, is a very important one, and often a place that people will go to or be taken to as young people to try and heal. Until they took that child out, there was not much the health and education could do to prevent that petrol sniffing epidemic that was happening. Once that was addressed, plus with some education and targeted work that the school did, it went back to being how it was. So early intervention in something like that, once it gets established, it's much harder. Once there's been, petrol sniffing can lead to brain damage and a lot of complications. And so again, that early intervention, in the end what the school principal did was bring in a retired Aboriginal assistant teacher, a principal that had knew the community, that had influence, and by working really closely with him, they were able to stop that.
5 minutes.
So just to go through the things that I've seen, so school-based education is a really valuable thing. Often as health centre staff, we get caught up in the clinical and dealing with things that are coming in the door, accidents, heart attacks, but some of the most valuable work we do is in schools, particularly teaching the older children. And we're trying to get away from the boring didactic lecture or flip chart that talks about nutrition or health and things, to try to do more interactive work. One of the exciting things that I was involved with around health education was working with the assistant and a young male assistant teacher. So young men are the holy grail in terms of health promotion, and they're the hardest group to reach, but they have a big impact on the well-being of their partners. If they understand the reasons that antenatal care, nutrition, not smoking, not drinking is important, much easier to work together. So, but reaching young men is very hard, particularly with health issues. But in a program that we ran, the young Aboriginal health community worker in our health centre worked with an assistant teacher. They had been hunting and fishing and doing things like that together, and developed some iPhone videos of healthy nutrition. Instead of the flip charts, that when we showed it to the young mothers, it had all the elements of what leads to engagement. You can identify with the people on the screen. It's telling stories, and that really got a high level of engagement. We were able to then talk about some more detailed issues. So there's creative things that can be done around health education in schools. This is an example of a community-based thing that we do. Again, where the school was a very important part. And sometimes we find that the teachers are great and the principals are great, really understand the value. Other times there's not as much engagement, and then these programs don't work. In this case, it's a Healthy Homes, Healthy Skin Day, where what often happens is households are like a collection of many families, and so sometimes it can be like a share house where once rubbish starts collecting or dishes start collecting, it's no one's responsibility, or it's too overwhelming for one or two people to fix. And so we have these community-wide days where the Shire gets involved, the schools get involved, and part of the focus is on creating a healthy community. And we get the children involved in that with the support of the school. This is one of the elders who would do some amazing health literacy. Again, most cases we're not the best to do the direct translating information in a way that people understand. But so she was able to bring young men that we would never be able to engage and share stories, taking the health literacy and converting it into stories about, how scabies is like a clam that goes under the sand, and just washing it won't get rid of it. We need to do this community-wide treatment. So elders are an important part, and then there's annual health checks. So before I finish school retention, I'd like to say two things. One, probably the thing that I think can be fatal to a young woman's well-being is early age pregnancy. And I've seen 13-year-olds who have fallen pregnant, apart from physical issues to do with the birth, with a small pelvis, underdeveloped pelvis. It's essentially means the end of their education. And I think I'm conscious of where I'm speaking, but the things that I have seen, there were a lot of health promotion strategies to talk about family planning, to talk about respect of the partner and things like that. But the other thing is health centres we had elders bringing their 15-year-old, 16-year-old children. There's a thing called Implanon, that's a 3-year contraceptive, and when people are older, they can make better choices. So if there is a child acting up, or if you're open to working with the health centre with things like health education around family planning, around the dangers of STIs and things like that, it's probably one of the most important things that I think as a health centre idea and as schools can do. And then I think as a partner in working with the community, the value that you may have as an individual is from how well I think you've developed relationships with some of the elders and the teachers and the others that you're working with. People that I saw that would burn out often, went home and closed the door after school, and I think there is an element of it's very hard to get that work-life balance, but if you do reach out and when people invite to ceremonies and things like that, and you're interested in people's well-being, one of the teachers said to me, you know, that it was their 3 years in the NT was some of the most meaningful work, partly because I think, like someone with very strong faith, the Indigenous elders that they work with, they didn't have the existential questions like, you know, what's the meaning of life, what should I be doing? There's just such a connection to family and land and to sort of ancestors that wasn't a question they had, and so often all they needed was very simple things to actually help themselves. Things like help to get a driving license that allowed a young man to then go and seek work, you know, and they're things that as a bridge we can, with the mainstream, we can be really eminently, we can solve those problems, but you can't do it from afar. So part of the challenge is to develop relationships while also keeping a bit to yourself. But if you can do that and get that balance right, I think it's some of the most rewarding work I've done. This was an elder that I worked with, Wewanga Maruka. She became one of the key health, scabies sort of health workers. There's this is a family that adopted my family, so this elder is an assistant teacher at Bukala School. She was key in pretty much everything. She'd advised me, you know, people don't like the way things are being done at the moment. It seems a bit heavy-handed. It's not going to work unless you spend more time. And you know, we might be experts in health or education, but they're very much experts in how things work. And those relationships are the ones that often carry us through. And having a family or being part of the community instead of at arm's length meant that people were more likely to trust and work with you. It's one of the things that I think mistrust is the initial thing you have to deal with. Partly there's a lot of history of times when trust has been broken, and so being there and showing that you're making a commitment, and often some of the best work I saw wasn't by the flying people from cities that were working on health issues, but often came with sort of not a missionary, but with faith, and particularly like the churches and the Aboriginal Resource Centre in Yukata, which was doing the education translation, Bible translation work, but had a long-term perspective, were the ones doing some of the valuable work in health, because it wasn't just a 6-month thing, and nothing changes in 6 months in this context. I'll stop on that note and open to questions.
Any quick questions?
Are Indigenous people open to like immunisation?
Very much. Some of the really high rates, we had 95%. In fact, it's interesting, people prefer needles actually, because they saw how effective penicillin was. You know, it used to be very high, you die of an infection, and then people came with penicillin, and so we're very open to that. Often if we don't give an injection, people think it's sort of substandard. That's changing now. Now there's young children who are born without that knowledge of the death, how devastating a simple infection can be.
Any other questions?
Do you think, what was one of the main reasons you think like mothers or partners didn't buy more nutritional foods? Was it that they didn't know about nutrition, or they didn't want to spend the money, or it wasn't available?
Yeah, I think it's all of those. So one is there's a knowledge thing that even in the mainstream, you know, we still see there's a knowledge that you need to have about when to introduce solids, and also what type of solids to introduce. And so that's the first thing. Second thing is it does cost more. So to get an ideal complementary food, it's either you've got to buy, you know, in Morisset you'd be buying baby food, or you need to, you know, have a range of vegetables. If you're trying to do it without animal source foods, it's even more complex. And then, because babies have small stomachs, but very high nutritional demands, it has to be, so it's a very specific type of food. And you'll see it in, you know, I have of the friends that have had children recently in that 2-year age, even with the best knowledge of doctors, and then, you know, they'll still have kids dropping off weight because they're fussy eaters, they're not so interested in food. So it's a very difficult time to protect nutrition, particularly, you know, the human genome's adapted to a hunter-gatherer diet, not a cereal-based diet. The agricultural revolution that led to a lot of cereals came before our genome was set, you know, to the diet that's optimal for us. So there's those two things, and then the third is just practicality. Non-perishable foods, which is so much easier if you've got a household with 7 kids and 20 adults, you know, 3 families living together. If you're cooking for a family like that, so you might just make an adult meal, which might be bread with some meat and things like that. Very little vegetables. So part of it is addressing some of those practical things, which means the school gardens and things like that were successful, I think, had an important modelling benefit, and then it's for the store, the not-for-profit store, to subsidise the healthy food choices and make things like Coke and that more expensive or less attractive, you know, and providing substitutes like coconut milk. Coke gets a lot of advertising, and so there's just a lot more factors supporting those behaviours, and so to try and change that requires working with stores and multiple things, and that's the health sector's job as well as the stores. Less to do with, sorry, I can't figure out how to turn this on. So I think it's a combination of all those three, but I think the things where schools can intervene is by making young parents know how important that nutritional window is, and people want smart kids. You know, I have one of the things that just standing back to think, why are people doing this? But actually, if I was living there in similar situations, often I would struggle, and part of it is the educational knowledge base, you know, the microbe theory and things like that. For us, is 200 years of theory that we have to draw on. It's a relatively new concept, so there's arts, we're doing things like microscope literacy to explain to people that it's not spirits, but it's things like microbes that are causing illness, and the same way to explain the importance of a complementary diet, why juice and low value foods to that young child are toxic. Those sort of, that knowledge is an issue, and that's something where schools can play a part, and then the other things are around access.
I have a last question. Some of you might need to leave, that's okay, but while I've got such an experienced person in the room, did you have a question as well?
I was thinking, were they better off before the white people came and were all the non-valuable food? Because, you know, if they were living off the land, surely their children wouldn't have such bad health.
Yeah, it's a really hard chicken and egg. We could say the same about us, right? Like the diet now with it's a toxic environment we're living in, where to go to the bus stand or the train, there's a junk food dispenser, and you know, if you look at Europeans, when we went from that sort of nomadic or hunter-gatherer lifestyle to settle being farmers and having wheat and things, the average height declined because the basket of food was much less diverse. So the more diversity you have, the more you're likely to get the right composition of nutrients. So you know, those young boys were celebrating their hunting and things like that. I don't think it's one or the other. It's almost it's not a question of whether we can go back or not to a pre sort of contact diet. that's one of the things that our community was doing, you know, finding ways to make the women have amazing knowledge of bush foods, and that's one of the things the young mothers wanted to do with the elders. Was in the community kitchen, which was associated with the school, was to have a day on bush foods and things like that. Interestingly, some of that knowledge is being lost because there's so many elders dying.
I think on that note, we'll finish. My question was going to be a political one. It was, Woody, what do you think about the Northern Territory intervention from a medical doctor's perspective? Does it have any merit, yes or no?
The way you answer those questions is, I think health and education is very valuable for, and that young practitioners have an important role to play in the future.
Very diplomatic answer.
To be honest.
Diplomatic answer. Lastly, before you put your hands together, Woody, there's a show on TV on ABC, I think it is. What is that show that you're...
Yeah, so those young kids that did the video, so that was a clinic I was working in. We put it together, and they wanted to see how far it could go, so we pitched it to ABC. They said, oh, it's too gory, you know, it had a bit of hunting, we had spelling mistakes. But then we pitched it to a production company, and they actually and we got $500,000 of ABC funding. And those 4 boys, so assistant teacher from Nikala, the community health worker, the white driver in the clinic, and the Aboriginal health worker, young teens, they're starring in the reality TV show. It's got Black As. It's about healthy lifestyles and nutrition. It's not about ideal.
Cool. So tune into that, and this man is mostly behind that show. Put your hands together, please.